I also didn't want this movie to resolve in a full hero journey. I didn't want this to be about the individual at the end and kind of like focus on the individual and leave behind the system and leave behind the kind of like larger world that the individual becomes enmeshed in. We think of science as sort of just like these objective fact finders who are, looking at yes or no answers and then moving on. But it's very messy and murky, very much like when you're writing something or you're trying to come up with an idea. You look at what your draft of what you've written and you sort of see what it's telling you. And I found that in studying in documenting science, that kind of like relationship with the work is often yields the most fruitful sort of new ideas in science. I was making like beats in high school on like, MIDI keyboards, and it sort of grew from there to like trying to just score my first doc. And I've just sort of developed my own little weird practice, I think, over the years scoring, because I don't know how to read or write music. I just do it all by ear. And it just sort of grew out of sort of feeling like I knew what kind of tone I wanted to go for. Alex Lindy came up with the solution here, which we used, which is it's basically like it's an 8x8 frame of 2x4s. It's just like he built a wood frame for this thing, which is very cheap to do. So now we have like a wood frame cube, and then he just got steel plating to cover two sides of it, because we didn't, the thing was we didn't have enough budget to cover we didn't have enough budget to cover 6 sides for sure, but we couldn't even cover 4 sides. So we only had 2 sides of the cube ever covered. And when we would shoot coverage around the cube, we would just twist it because it was light enough. We could just move the cube on its base so that the 2 sides were always facing camera. And that's what we did. And it actually didn't end up costing that much at all to do it that way. Also didn't want this movie to resolve in a full hero journey. I didn't want this to be about the individual at the end and kind of like focus on the individual and leave behind the system and leave behind the kind of like larger world that the individual becomes enmeshed in. I purposely wanted to kind of like follow Ray for a while and then see that this larger action was going on in the forest, and leave Ray and kind of like go with that to the implications of that. And in showing the script to people going into the movie, and even in critical responses to it I've read, after it's come out, that didn't work for people and still doesn't work for some people. I definitely wanted to end with this like organized collective action moment, and not care so much about one person being the hero. He had something that was useful for the group, but I wanted to arrive at a group sensibility and then sort of like foreshadow what the next struggle might be. So there's this like successful action of turning off the robots in the forest. And I guess that what I wanted to do there a little bit was to beg the question if people had noticed that Ray had gone and tried to charge his phone at the same garage earlier in the movie. And the guy had kind of come out dickishly and told him like, no, sorry, no charging here. Well, now we have the same person allowing in the piece of machinery that people have worked so hard to turn off in the woods to hold the picket line is another scraping of money from off the backs of someone else. But he's also trusting a machine more than a human. And it's also, I think it suggests, I guess my feeling there is that like, as much of a victory as the people could have in this movie and in what they did in the woods, in order to scale this up, you would need to include the people in between that like upper middle class area to get them on your side, on your coalition, to affect even greater change. I certainly don't want to just make things that aestheticize subjects like this and don't dig into the thorny issues of exploitation and privilege. And certainly that I do want to have a class consciousness in the work I do. As someone who came from a very privileged background and only kind of came into my own class consciousness about that later in my 20s, really, I tried to actually, that was actually part of the character of Ray in the film, was someone who gets out into the forest, realizes he has all these points that, you know, he didn't necessarily get himself by cabling. He's been given this identity, right, by this medallion. And so I really was thinking a lot about that, of poking through the way I had been thinking about kind of like pure meritocracy, and like, if I, yeah, I had like famous parents, but if I'm just like a guy now, if I just like work hard like everyone else, that's right, like I started in the same boat. And it's like, no. And I only realized that, you know, later. And I wanted to investigate that in the movie and to poke at that. And I think the character of Anna pokes at that framework, that worldview. And that was important to me in this movie. And I definitely, going forward, you know, don't want to lose those kinds of critiques and awarenesses of certainly my privilege, and hopefully pointing at larger, you know, systems that aren't just about my own setup as a human. But I'd like to continue to make work that is class conscious and that does have a critique in it, and that is pointing at something.